So one of the things that informs the literature and culture of the early 20th century, especially the 1920s, is the question of the modern woman, right? And what to do. A lot of changes, huge changes. Remember that in the 1920s, people were really kind of coming off of the Victorian era, and it's somewhat, some people would say, oppressive, stifling social cultural conventions, if you will, especially with regard to gender roles. They were very, remember, for example, Kate Chopin's work, or the works of some of the other writers that we've read. Margaret Fuller, for example, earlier part of the Victorian era, where women's roles were very prescribed. They were very rigid. There were things that women did and didn't do. The 1920s, of course, is the era of the 19th Amendment. Okay, women getting the vote, the suffrage movement, but in so many more ways than just political. There was a real revolution going on with regard to women's status, their position changing on issues related to sex, marriage, independence, just a general liberation of all of that time. Most of you have heard of flappers, okay? Interesting sort of theories on where the term flapper comes from. It's generally young girl is what it meant. It's kind of English slang, I believe, but we imported it over here. And what you saw in the 1920s was this rise of young women who were considerably more independent, better educated, who wanted to live their own lives and didn't want to be told what to do by society, parents, institutions, etc. And some of it led to a lot of excesses, as you can imagine. Young people do that. But also a lot of it led to permanent change in the way women perceived themselves. And they saw this everywhere. They saw it in, like I said, the nightclubs and flappers, and, it's prohibition time. So you would go out, and if you were like 20 or 22 or 24 or whatever, and you're a single young woman, you might go out with your friends to speakeasies where you're drinking something you probably wouldn't ordinarily. You shouldn't, because it's illegal, but hey, it's prohibition. But there's also bootlegging. Young women at the time started smoking cigarettes, right? Don't do that. But it was a way of kind of striking out on their own and saying, I'm going to live my own life, and you can't tell me what to do. Fashion changed hugely. Listen, I want to send in with our class email a couple of videos that are just really brief, but they're really fun to look at. The fashions were so different. Now, if you notice down there in the middle there, these were the kinds of long-waisted, very low-waisted, flat-chested kind of outfits that a lot of young women during the times wore. But you'll notice that there's something showing. Oh dear, it's ankles. Goodness. That's something their mothers would never have done, right? Victorian women would never have done that. People at the turn of the century wouldn't have done it. It's the 1920s that hemlines began to go up a little bit, sometimes a lot, and girls began to dress with fashion that today seems quite innocuous and not terribly scandalous at all, but at the time was terribly scandalous. Moreover, they frequently cut their hair. They bobbed their hair with short haircuts, which was considered very, very radical to do, because women were supposed to grow their hair long and all of this kind of stuff, but bobbing your hair was a way of striking out and becoming sort of your own person. So the fashions, today we look at them and say, gosh, they're a lot of fun. So I got a couple of videos that I'm going to ask you to look at. I'll give you the links in the email for this assignment. One of them is about flapper culture. It's about 7 minutes long. It's really cool. The other one is just a 1 minute sort of visual of all the beautiful dresses and fashion and outfits. Some people love that stuff. Some people don't. I think it's really interesting. It's not my thing, but it's very interesting how creative and beautiful they got. As opposed to the sort of drab, old, stuffy Victorian stuff, even with the giant bustle on the back end and the puffy sleeves and things and the big giant hats. Something really was changing, and you can see it in the way that young women conducted themselves. Big movie stars like Clara Bow down here, down below me, over here, Clara Bow and Louise Brooks became sort of these kinds of sex symbols. Clara Bow was trying to be she was called the It Girl. She was really big, very popular in movies during the silent era. Sadly, her life fell apart. But she was very popular. Everyone loved her. Everyone thought they wanted to be like her. But then there were all these terrible rumors about her sex life that came along. Probably untrue, but she was not terribly stable person. Louise Brooks, just a beautiful, stunningly, she's kind of the image of the era. You look up some pictures of Louise Brooks. She's just a beautiful woman. And all of a sudden, she just kind of fell off the radar screen. Sadly, she became addicted to different drugs and alcohol. And while she made a comeback at the end of her life, and she really was a striking. Both of these women were like the icons of the era, along with Josephine Brooks. She made more of an impact over in Paris. Because the Parisians really took to her interesting dance style and music and these kinds of things. And also because France was much more welcoming to African-American artists at the time. I think they were anyway. But these women became these iconic figures of fashion, style, but most importantly, how young women comported themselves, right? How they behaved, how it was okay to be edgy. Now, of course, Great Depression comes along. Styles change, hemlines drop, right? People become more conservative, and they begin to look at the 1920s as this era where we went too far. We went too far socially, culturally, economically, and now we're paying the price in the Great Depression, etc. But for the time, it was considered to be a really radical time to be alive. Somewhat akin like to the 1960s with free love and all this kind of stuff. One of the big areas, and we're going to see this with Edna St. Vincent Millay, she's down in the lower left-hand corner. One of the big areas is this question of sexuality, okay, and relationships. Not all about sex, but relationships. And, the Victorian prescription for a relationship is you met someone that your parents introduced you to. You would never marry someone or go out with somebody without, their complete approval. The courtship process was very structured. You had to be chaperones and all these kinds of things. And certainly no hanky-panky before marriage. No, can't do that. Beyond that, also, the idea that your role as a wife once you got married was very, very strictly defined. But Edna St. Vincent Millay and other young women at the time, writers, artists, dancers, whatever, began to say, let's question all of that. Let's take a look at First Fig and Second Fig. These are very brief poems. I mean, they're just almost just little tiny snippets. But they have something to say about her love life, right? She said, and she was one of those women of the era who admitted, I live life to the fullest and I have no regrets. Okay. My candle burns at both ends. Have you heard that phrase before? Someone who burns their candle at both ends. What happens to the candle is it burns out fast, right? There's somebody who lives life like in the fast lane all the time, right? Out drinking, partying, doing whatever. I don't hold back. I'm not demure. I go full throttle. My candle burns at both ends. I will not last the night, right? It will not last the night. I live my life in a way that's just really fast. And it's not gonna. I'm not here for a long time. I'm here for a good time. You've heard that before. But my foes and my friends, it gives a lovely light. In other words, the way I live my life is right out there and very into like all the experiences I can get. And I know that means I may have a short life, but it's going to be a great life. Okay, that was the attitude of the era among a lot of young women, especially, but young men as well. F. Scott Fitzgerald talks about how this culture of the 20s and this kind of attitude didn't always end up with good consequences, but that's for another day. Second Fig, safe upon the solid rock, the ugly houses stand. Come and see my shining palace built upon the sand. Now, of course, this is a biblical reference, right? Where Jesus talks about building your house upon a rock and people who build their house upon the sand and then they get washed away, right? You build your house. He's talking about faith and his admonition that you should put your faith in God rather than in things or fleeting things, etc. But she's kind of flipping it on its head and says, I'd rather live on the sand because it's prettier. And she says, and it's not going to last. I know it's not going to last. Those beautiful, precious moments in life, this is are fleeting. But I'd rather have those than live a long life that's boring and ugly and on a rock, right? I don't think she's making any kind of religious statement here at all. I mean, I really don't. She's just kind of borrowing that the way she would with the candle burning at both ends, these allusions to famous sayings or whatnot is what she's trying to turn on their heads, you see. But you get this: safe upon the solid rock, the ugly houses stand. Come and see my shining palace built upon the sand. Oh, well, your palace won't last very long. I know, but isn't it pretty? Right? You can't live your life like that forever. No, I can't. But and I may not live long, but I'm going to enjoy life to its fullest. So it's very Epicurean, if you will, pleasure-seeking, hedonistic, some people would call it. Look at her other poem, What My Lips Have Kissed. And this is a little bit more specific about her love life. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why, I have forgotten. And what arms have lain under my head till morning, but the rain. So she's like, I've forgotten all the people I've. What is it you young people say now? Her body count? How disgusting. Anyway, shocking to talk about. But she's kind of talking about her body count, I'll be honest with you. And I've forgotten how, and I've forgotten all the people I've, done it with or made out with. We'll give her the benefit of the doubt. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. Ghosts? What ghosts? Oh, probably memories of former lovers. Right? And so tonight, of all nights, maybe it's raining outside and she's being reminded of all the people that she once had flings with. And in my heart, there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. So she says, in my heart, there's a quiet pain for these beautiful young men that I've been with before, but I'm never going to hear from again. Thus, in the winter, stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one. So there's a comparison here between herself and a lonely tree in wintertime, right? Where once there were birds and all these kinds of things, but the birds have now vanished, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. All the leaves have fallen, etc. That's in the past. Now I don't have these lovers in my life anymore. I don't have the beauty of spring and all this kind of stuff and all these dalliances that I once did that she enjoyed so much, evidently. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. All I can say, I can't say how many guys I've been in love with, how many lovers have come and gone. All I know is that at one point, boy, life was beautiful. And it's now gone. Okay. Okay. So I mean, so she's very candid about that. This is just not something that a previous generation of women would write about, much less publish, right? That they wanted to experience that passion in their lives, that romance, and sexuality as well. Let's take a look at, I'm trying to go through this as quickly as I can. I don't want to take forever here. Let's take a look at Louise Bogan, who kind of is in a way kind of a counterbalance to this, but in a way it's quite consistent with the poetry of the era. So we have young women who are now striking out and becoming their own writers, living their own lives, claiming their own sphere for themselves and saying, I'm entitled to live the way I want to live, not the way everybody thinks I should live. Okay. And sort of thumbing their nose at societal convention. But Louise Bogan is disturbed, or I won't say disturbed. She exhibits kind of the strain of thinking that includes self-doubt and sort of ambiguity about this. And this was not at all uncommon. Remember, it was the woman question of the era. That's what, Harper's and all these different magazines kept talking about. What do we do about all these young women who are behaving in a way that their mothers would never have behaved, right? And what are going to be the consequences of that? And of course, a lot of people want to draw some morality. Well, when one day they're all going to pay a price. Oh dear, yes. And then others would say, well, it may not be the price you think. Okay. Maybe it's self-doubt. Maybe it's, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what to do here. We're going to see that with one of our upcoming short stories, Big Blonde. It's an interesting piece by a very famous writer, Dorothy Parker. But let's take a look at Louise Bogan's poem simply entitled Women. Women have no wilderness in them. They are provident instead. Now, contrast this poem, for example, which is dealing with, what should be or what is the role of a woman poet, what can she achieve, and contrast it with, or bear in mind, Anne Bradstreet's prologue, where she makes an eloquent statement about women's abilities, etc. Is Louise Bogan in this poem saying we women can't do what men do, or is she saying, well, we aren't doing what men do, and why she's saying that? Excuse me. Women have no wilderness in them. Is that because they're incapable, or is it because we as a gender are not exploring the wilderness that we should within us? What kind of wilderness? It's psychological, emotional wilderness. We're not exploring that. Okay. They are provident instead, meaning they have answers or reasons instead. They're not risk takers. Are we not risk takers artistically because that's how we are as a gender? That we're innately not risk takers, or because we're not encouraged to take risk, or because, what is it? Are we just fundamentally different from men? Okay. Content in the tight, hot cell of their hearts to eat dusty bread. That seems rather critical to me, right? That we women are this way. I don't think that's an acceptance of that. I think it's a criticism of it, that we are not doing what we should do. We're not living up to our potential artistically because we don't allow ourselves, right, to escape the tight, hot cell of our hearts and to venture into poetic subjects that may be beyond our own personal emotional experience, because maybe society constrains us to say, no, this is your realm. Don't go into areas of philosophy and social commentary and things of this nature, right? To eat the dusty bread of our tight, hot cells of our hearts. They do not see cattle cropping red winter grass. They do not hear snow water going down under culverts, shallow and clear. There's not a lot of nature poetry. There's not a lot of big consideration. We're all stuck in a different type of poetry. She said. They wait when they should turn to journeys, right? They wait when they should turn to journeys. They're sit in our parlors and we write about our feelings, when we ought to be out there in the big wide world writing about exploring life and the world and different places and things. They stiffen when they should bend, right? We stiffen when we ought to be flexible. We ought to be, open-minded, instead of like, no, this is how I must behave. They use against themselves that benevolence to which no man is friend, right? So they have to have that benevolence. Remember when we talked about Charlotte Temple, benevolence was very important, right? Kind-heartedness, goodness, right? Sometimes men in their writing, they're not terribly kind, but it's still great writing, right? They're not terribly benevolent, right? Generous, but they still write great poetry because it stimulates the mind rather than the heart. And she's critical of women writers, I think, primarily of that ilk. They cannot think of so many crops to a field, or of clean wood cleft by an axe. Their love is an eager meaninglessness, too tense or too lax, right? So men have, male writers or poets, I think is what she's getting at here, are much more willing to go beyond just, the sort of stock ways of looking at things, is what she's getting at, I think. They hear in every whisper that speaks to them a shout and a cry. As like as not, when they take life over their door sills, they should let it go by, right? So this is a poem that it seems to me is critical of women writers in particular, women poets in particular. The question is, of course, why is she? Or what is the basis of that criticism? Is it just an acknowledgement that this is how we are as women? We don't do these things and men do. Or is it more of an admonition that we don't do these kind of things, we don't write these kinds of things, we don't explore these kinds of issues or topics in our writing, and should? Why do we limit ourselves? I think I lean more towards the latter, but the criticism is real. Is it descriptive of the condition of women? If so, what is the explanation of why women writers, in her mind, limit themselves in this way? Is it because they are themselves limited as creatures? I don't think so. But it's interesting to kind of put this up against Bradstreet, who's much more forceful in saying, this is how this is what I'm doing, and this is my argument, really, against those who would be critical. This is actually kind of taking the flip side of that and saying, no, there's an acknowledgement. As writers, we're not doing things that men are doing. The question is why? Is it because we're somehow failing ourselves? And then what's in the culture that does that? Interesting kind of thing here. One of her great quotes, I think, is a very, very interesting. Think about this one. It's a good one. Innocence of heart and violence of feeling. Two things, right? Innocence of heart, right? It means purity of heart, right? You have to be a well-intentioned, pure-hearted person. And violence of feeling, meaning really feeling strongly about something, right? Having pure motives and a passion are necessary in any kind of superior achievement. Any kind, not just artistic, right? Business. The arts cannot exist without them, right? Certainly in the arts, they can't exist. So you have to have these two combinations. That's a really thoughtful thing. And it's worthy of you kind of spending a moment and pondering it just a bit. Is it true? You have to have sort of an innocence in your heart, but a passion in as well, a violent feeling, are necessary if you ever want to achieve anything. It could be in athletics, it could be in science, it could be in business, it could be anything. But she says specifically, for sure, the arts cannot exist without them. You have to have these things to succeed in the arts. I think that's an interesting, thought-provoking thing. She's a really cerebral writer in my mind, right? And I think she's a little bit disappointed that other women writers of the era weren't being as bold and intellectual in their exploration through their art as they could or should be, because they're being held back by sort of the conventions of, well, it's okay if women write touchy-feely poems and lovey-dovey poems, but if they write poems about philosophy and politics and culture and nature, then they're really out of their league. Something in common there with Anne Bradstreet. I implore you to consider it. Okay, so we only have one quiz question this time. I'll move my face. And that is really not a question. I want you to kind of provide an example of imagery from one of these poems that we just discussed. Not Oread, we already did that one in class, but one of these poems that we just of imagery, and offer a brief analysis. And I'm talking like 2 to 3 sentences. That's all. Not a giant paragraph. Please don't. Of what the poem is trying to achieve, what the poet is trying to achieve in presenting that image to the reader. Just pick one out of here. Tell me, what's the poet trying to achieve in presenting that image? What's that image supposed to do to us as a reader? How are we supposed to process that? What is the effect of that image in the poem? What's the poet up to is another way to put it. What is she up to in offering an image like this? What's she wanting to achieve? Okay. The quiz, such as it is, really kind of a response more than a quiz. And your discussion, I'll have a discussion post for us, probably 2 to choose from, are due by midnight on Tuesday. All right. See you in class.